Hey everyone, tonight we're trading warm blankets for togas, scrolls and the cold marble floors of a Roman courtroom. Forget modern justice with lawyers in suits and polite objections. In ancient Rome, courtrooms were chaotic, ruthless and wildly theatrical. More gladiator pit than legal process. Imagine standing in front of a crowd, your fate hanging on the volume of your voice, the cleverness of your Latin, or how well connected your opponent is. There are no microphones, no due process, and definitely no mercy. The stakes, property, freedom, sometimes even your life, all decided by a room full of powerful men in sandals. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, let your mind wander, and allow the gentle rhythm of my voice to lull you towards sleep. Maybe settle in, pull your blanket a little closer, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's imagine you've somehow landed in ancient Rome. Not as a gladiator or a senator, but as something arguably worse. A private citizen accused of something vague and ominous. Maybe it's property fraud. Maybe you bumped into the wrong equestrian in the forum. Or maybe you just own land someone richer than you wants. Whatever the case, you're being summoned to court. Now don't imagine a solemn marble courtroom with columns and whispered respect for due process. Imagine instead a packed open-air forum, the smell of sweat and garum in the air, and about 40 people yelling at once. There are no judges in wigs. There are no benches. There is shouting, gesturing, and quite possibly spitting. And you, somehow, are supposed to make a good impression in all this. Welcome to the Basilica, Rome's version of a courthouse/political wrestling ring. It's a public venue, a performance space, and your trial will be less justice and more morality-themed theatre. You walk in wearing your cleanest tunic. A friend lent it to you. It smells faintly of vinegar and panic. You're greeted by a clerk who looks like he's been breathing scroll dust for 20 years. He grunts, takes your name, and tells you to wait until your case is called. That could be 10 minutes or 4 days. Roman time is a suggestion. You wait. You sweat. You try not to make eye contact with the man selling snails on a stick near the atrium. Eventually, someone with far too much confidence announces your name. It's time to defend your honour and your goats. Step 1. The oath, the glares, and the guy who talks too loud. Before anything else happens, you must swear a sacred oath to the gods in public. You step forward, hand trembling slightly, and say something about Jupiter Optimus Maximus and how you're totally telling the truth. Nobody believes you. Then your accuser stands and begins speaking, not calmly, not reasonably, but with fire, hand gestures, and what appears to be prepared scrolls in hexameter. You blink. Your brain begins to overheat. You understand about every third word, most of which are just scandal, treason, and cow theft. You try to interrupt. Bad move. The crowd hisses. The presiding magistrate, who's been absent-mindedly doodling in the margin of his wax tablet, sighs and gestures for you to shut up. It's their turn. Step 2. You say words. No one cares. Finally, you're allowed to respond. You clear your throat. You speak. You're almost eloquent. You even remember a quote from Cicero. No one listens. Because across the aisle, your opponent just snapped a wax tablet in half to emphasize his point. A nearby spectator gasps. Someone drops a fig. You continue speaking. A small boy starts playing knucklebones near your feet. Someone's dog begins barking. Your words float up into the air and disappear like incense smoke. The magistrate scratches his beard and announces that a decision will be made. Eventually. Probably tomorrow, or the day after, or during Saturnalia. Who knows? Step 3. Bribery season is open. You return home, defeated, but your legal advisor, a man with one eyebrow and a surprisingly expensive ring, informs you that all is not lost. You see, Roman justice has a second layer, backstage negotiations. This is where the real decisions happen. So over the next few days, you begin what can only be described as the most exhausting schmooze fest of your life. You send wine. You flatter important people. You commission poems. You promise to support someone's cousin's campaign for Quista. This has nothing to do with your innocence, of course. But it might shave a few months off your sentence. Or at least move your name off the definitely guilty scroll. So you've survived the early stages of your Roman courtroom ordeal. You've stumbled through the Forum's human zoo, endured the prosecutor's opening performance, which had the dramatic flair of a bad actor and the bloodlust of a shark with a scroll, and now it's your advocate's turn to speak. Which sounds great, until you meet him. Your advocate is not a lawyer, he's a vibes curator. Now, in your modern mind, you're probably picturing a lawyer, suit, briefcase, solemn demeanour, someone with degrees and a bar certification. In Rome, your advocate is more of an orator meets gossip columnist, meets professional grandstander. He'd been trained not in law but in rhetoric, which is a polite way of saying he's good at yelling with flair. He's dressed in a toga so heavily starched it can slice cheese. His hair is curled and oiled to a point of self-reflection. He greets you with the warm, professional assurance of a man who once won an inheritance case by comparing his opponent to a diseased turnip. You ask nervously what his plan is. He replies, "We're going to win this, with pathos," which is Latin for, "I'm going to make them cry, and we'll just hope that's enough." Step 1. Selective facts and strange comparisons. Your advocate begins by reintroducing you to the court, loudly and with a touch of poetic license. Suddenly you're no longer a hapless defendant with a slightly crooked nose. You're a humble citizen descended from noble Sabine shepherds, forged by the same sun that ripened the wheat of old Latium. You glance nervously at the jury. Are they buying this? One is dozing. Another is picking wax out of his ear with a stylus. Your advocate ploughs forward. He refers to the prosecutor as a man of shifting principles like a weathercock in a tempest, and then gestures meaningfully at the statue of justice, which, by the way, does not have a blindfold. Roman justice stares you dead in the eyes while holding a sword. Comforting. Step 2. Logical fallacies and emotional damage. There is no objection here. No one stops anyone for leading the witness, misquoting evidence, or launching into emotional soliloquies about the downfall of Rome if you, yes, you, are convicted. Your advocate tells the court that you're not merely innocent. No, if you are punished, the gods themselves will weep. Farmers will sow dust. Children will forget their fathers. Bread will turn to ash in the mouths of the hungry. You feel deeply moved by this. You also notice that none of it has anything to do with the actual charge, which, just to remind you, was failure to properly deliver a consignment of amphorae containing slightly sour fish sauce. But the point isn't legal accuracy, it's spectacle. Step 3. Character witnesses of questionable quality. Your advocate calls character witnesses. First up, an elderly neighbour who insists you once rescued a chicken from drowning. The second, a retired legionary who vaguely remembers you giving him a fig. The third, a small boy who stares at the crowd, waves at his mother, and then says, He smells like soap. It's unclear whether this helps, but your advocate looks triumphant. The jury looks confused. Someone in the crowd claps. Step 4. The audience gets involved. Yes, the public has shown up. They've brought snacks and opinions. Someone heckles. Another shouts shame when the prosecutor tries to interject. A woman nearby is loudly explaining to her friend why she thinks you're definitely guilty because of the shape of your ears. Your advocate pauses dramatically, raises a hand, and just to spice things up begins quoting Virgil. You try not to make eye contact with anyone. Step 5. The emotional climax complete with weeping. Now comes the final push. Your advocate, in full tragic mode, invokes your ancestors. He points out your calluses, proof you're a worker of virtue. He accuses the prosecution of seeking personal revenge for an unrelated incident involving a borrowed mule and a spilled amphora. Then, in a bold move, he tears a piece of his own toga, looks heavenward and says, "Let Jupiter strike me down if this man is guilty." There's a beat of silence. Someone in the gallery sneezes. The moment passes. Your advocate bows slightly and steps back. You're told to remain standing. The jurors, most of whom have not taken a single note, begin murmuring among themselves. You think it's over. It's not. Step 6. Rebuttal, or the ancient Roman roast battle. Because now it's time for the prosecutor's rebuttal, which means we're back to personal insults, increasingly loud metaphors, and thinly veiled threats involving grain prices and imperial favour. He accuses your advocate of being a washed-up rhetorician with the intellectual rigour of a fig. He calls you a danger to public hygiene, and then spends 10 minutes explaining how your lack of beard grooming is evidence of your moral decay. Your advocate objects, passionately, but in Latin, the phrase for "he's making this up" is basically just video fallacium, and no one really cares. The prosecutor finishes by pointing at you and saying, "Would you trust this man with your olives?" Someone in the audience mutters, "Not my olives." Laughter ensues. You die a little inside. Let's begin with a fun question. Do you know how Roman juries decided court cases? Don't worry, neither did they. We begin naturally with bribery. Now I know what you're thinking. Bribery? In the sacred courts of the Roman Republic, in the gleaming marble halls where Cicero once spoke, and where statues of stern-faced gods gaze down from above? Yes, especially there. Bribery wasn't just common. It was expected. The entire system practically ran on it, like olive oil through cracked pottery, or fish sauce down a toga. Here's how it worked. You could bribe the judge. You could bribe the jury. You could bribe the other side's witnesses to mysteriously forget everything they saw. You could bribe court attendants to misplace certain scrolls, or delay proceedings until your wealthy uncle arrived from Etruria with more denarii. There were even special words for this. Ambitus referred to electoral bribery, but the concept happily spilled over into trials too. If someone accused you of ambitus in court, that didn't mean they disapproved. It meant you were better at it than they were. And if caught, you didn't go to jail. You simply went into exile. Usually somewhere nice like Rhodes with good figs. The jury, of course, was not composed of your peers, not unless your peers happened to be wealthy men who'd spent their youth learning how to declaim Virgil while balancing on a horse. Juries were made up of senators, equestrians, or ex-magistrates, depending on the political climate of the month. None of them were trained in law. Most had political loyalties that mattered far more than whatever you did or didn't do with those amphorae of spoiled fish sauce. One juror might be loyal to your patron, another might owe a favour to the prosecutor's cousin, a third might still be hungover from Saturnalia. Together they would decide your fate using the ancient Roman system of vibes. No deliberation room, no secret ballots in envelopes, just murmured opinions, quickly formed alliances, and occasionally the intervention of a very expensive advocate who helped clarify the law by shouting quotes from Homer. And what was the actual law? That's adorable. You think that mattered? The Romans had laws, of course, in staggering quantity. They had tablets, scrolls, decrees, edicts, and enough fine print to cause early onset blindness. But most trials were less about the law and more about status. Who was more respected? Who had better friends? Who could quote Cicero faster? Who had the most impressive sandals? The average Roman defendant had no clue what law they'd broken. The prosecutor often didn't either. Which is why trial speeches often reference mythology, moral decay, or that one time the defendant refused to donate to the temple renovation. Let's talk about time. Roman court cases did not move quickly. There were no calendars on the docket, just a rotating cast of delays, holidays, religious festivals, augurs declaring it a bad omen day, sudden plagues, or half the jury vanishing to attend a better trial involving gladiators and a scandalous widow. You might wait weeks just to get to your verdict. Meanwhile, you're not allowed to leave the city. You're still paying your advocate's grooming expenses, and your neighbours keep asking if it's true you once poisoned a goat. You never even owned a goat. And now, the gods get involved. Because when legal logic fails, and it will, there's always divine intervention. People might swear oaths in the names of Jupiter, Mars, or even obscure household deities whose names sound like salad ingredients. And if you lied under oath, sure, maybe the gods would punish you. But they also might be busy, or drunk, or annoyed you never sacrificed anything fancier than stale bread. So when you desperately appeal to Jupiter's justice, the jury nods solemnly, and then does exactly what your social status tells them to do. But wait, what about evidence? Oh yes, evidence. That thing you thought mattered. Let me introduce you to the Roman evidence system. It was flexible. Documents, often forged. Witnesses, bribed, coerced, or confused. Physical proof? Sure, but good luck getting a jury of senators to inspect a fish sauce stain on your tunic when they're distracted by a nearby vendor selling honeyed nuts. In short, evidence was less about facts and more about performance. Did you present it well? Was it delivered with drama? Did it come with a sobbing child or a well-timed quote from Horace? If so, you might just have a chance. You're still standing, by the way. You haven't sat down since this started. Your knees hurt. Your stomach is growling. Someone in the back row is loudly eating dates. Another man is playing with a pet monkey, which may or may not be house-trained. The crowd grows restless. Your advocate bows dramatically. The prosecutor puffs his chest. And then, finally, the verdict is announced. But not always clearly, not always quickly. Sometimes the jury just shrugs. Sometimes they write their votes on little wooden tablets and toss them in a basket. You don't get to see them. The presiding magistrate does. He squints. He whispers with an aide. He frowns. Then he reads the result. Non licet. Not clear. Try again later. To be continued. So the verdict is in. Or not. Because sometimes, as we've just seen, the Roman courts didn't exactly feel the need to decide anything. If the jury was split, confused, or just tired of standing in the sun, they could return a non licet, which loosely translated means meh. We're not sure. Try again later, or don't. And that's only if they didn't decide to simply acquit you because your advocate used more adjectives, or convict you because your shoes were dusty. But let's say they do reach a verdict. Say it's guilty. What now? Well, you might expect a stern punishment handed down with the majestic finality of Roman justice. Something grand. Something carved into stone and announced to the masses. Instead, you get options. Because Roman punishment wasn't so much about law breaking as it was about what kind of person you were when you broke the law. It's less what you did and more who you did it as. Are you a senator? Congratulations, you can choose exile. Are you a plebeian? You might be flogged or branded or thrown off the Tarpeian rock, which is just as unpleasant as it sounds. But exile. That was the deluxe option. Roman exile wasn't prison. It was essentially enforced vacation. You picked a scenic location, preferably outside Italy but close enough for decent wine shipments, and spent your days writing bitter poetry about your accuser. Cicero did this. So did Ovid. They went to places like Brundisium, or Tomis, or the coast of Illyricum, and wrote verses filled with rage, nostalgia, and an unhealthy amount of fish-based metaphors. And the best part, exile wasn't forever. If the political tide shifted, you could be recalled, brought back with applause, maybe even appointed to something important again, like overseeing grain shipments or organising temple games. Just don't mention that one time with the stolen silverware. If, however, you weren't quite elite enough for exile, then came damnatio memoriae. Ah, yes, the Roman art of erasing someone's existence, very loudly. If you were important and inconvenient, they didn't just kill you, they deleted you. Statues smashed, names chiselled off inscriptions, scrolls edited, portraits painted over. It was like the ancient world's version of unfriending someone with a hammer. Of course, this never really worked. People remembered, gossip survived, but it made the Senate feel powerful, which was most of the point. But let's rewind a bit. Say you were acquitted, you walk free, vindicated. What then? You don't go home and resume your life. Oh no, you host a banquet. Because in Rome, legal success wasn't complete until it was turned into a party. You invited your patron, your advocate, the jury, if they hadn't secretly voted against you, and every moderately influential person you could find. You serve oysters, wine, garum-soaked eggs, honeyed dormice, the works, and you toast your innocence loudly, even if everyone present still secretly believes you strangled your neighbour's goat. And just when you think you've moved on, someone publishes a satire, a poem, let's say, circulating through the forum, light-hearted on the surface but full of suspicious metaphors. A man who looks a lot like you is described as oily in speech and short in truth. The poem rhymes, of course. It's always the rhyming ones that sting. You try to ignore it. But the market sellers smirk when you pass. Children giggle. A senator asks if you're planning to borrow more public funds, then laughs too loudly. Congratulations. You've survived Roman justice, only to die a slow, metaphorical death by rumour. Even the gods have a say in your fate. Because if things go really badly, your prosecutor might claim that your crime offended not just the law, but divine order, sacrilege, impiety, failure to maintain the sacred chicken coop. Any excuse would do. You might be condemned to a ritual punishment, public penance, a sacrificial offering, or in extreme cases being sewn into a sack with a monkey, a rooster, a dog, and a snake, and thrown into the Tiber. Yes, that was a real thing. It was called poenocule. They believed it prevented your unclean soul from haunting the city, And no, there wasn't a version for people afraid of monkeys, but more often than not, Roman court outcomes were quieter. The true punishment wasn't death or exile, it was disgrace, a stain that never quite washed out of your toga. You became the man people pointed at with their eyebrows, the one who once stood trial, the one whose advocate flubbed his closing speech, the one who cried visibly when the jury paused too long. You might still go to dinner parties, but not the important ones. You might be greeted, but without warmth. You became socially invisible, present, but never quite presentable. Not legally guilty anymore, but not quite innocent enough for the next promotion. And then, like so many others, your name faded. Not erased by chisels, but by time. Your trial was replaced in gossip by the next one, involving a senator, his mistress, and 3 amphorae of suspicious wine. And the courtroom carried on. The benches were swept. The next advocate arrived. And someone, somewhere, filed another complaint about a boundary stone that hadn't been moved since the reign of Augustus. Justice in Rome was never blind. She had one eye open, a scale in one hand, and a purse of coins in the other. And if you made it through all of that, if you survived the speeches, the bribes, the shouting, the satire, the verdict, the shame, you still had to walk home, through crowded streets past vendors selling amulets to ward off envy, and orators rehearsing loudly for tomorrow's trial. And you hoped, silently, humbly, that no one ever summoned you again. But of course, someone would, eventually, because in Rome, everyone ended up in court, even the innocent, especially the innocent. Now, just when you thought the worst was behind you, you've been acquitted or exiled or humiliated with elegance. We arrive at the part no one warns you about, the aftermath. Not the poetic kind where you're praised for surviving a corrupt system with your dignity intact. Number. The real aftermath is paperwork. Endless, tedious, soul-eroding paperwork, because every Roman trial generated records, ledgers, scrolls, wax tablets covered in scribbled shorthand by bored scribes chewing fig seeds. Your case, regardless of outcome, became a part of the archive, a sticky, inky fingerprint in the endless bureaucracy of Roman administration. And that archive, it wasn't some well-organised library patrolled by wise old men in togas. It was a chaotic cupboard behind the Temple of Saturn, managed by a man named Publius, who probably lost your file under a stack of land disputes from the Sabine Hills. Still, technically, your trial is preserved. Somewhere. Your name and crime etched in brittle wax or copied on cheap papyrus that mice have long since turned into real estate. Meanwhile, your accuser, he's doing great. You see, in Rome, bringing an accusation was sometimes more beneficial than winning one. It made you visible, important, a man who stands for public morals. Even if your own villa has 5 unregistered fountains and a private shrine to Bacchus. Some professional accusers even made a career out of it. They were called delatores, men who prowled the courts like bloodhounds with scrolls. They knew every infraction, every half-legal grain shipment, every senator who borrowed funds to improve his bathhouse mosaics. They'd accuse you, ruin your reputation, collect a percentage of your fine, and walk away richer. It was less about justice and more about economics with a performance bonus. And Roman law encouraged it. Because Rome didn't have a police force in the modern sense. No detectives, no squad cars, no forensic teams dusting amphorae for fingerprints. They had you, the public, the angry neighbour, the jealous rival, the man who thought your new garden wall was 2 inches too tall, and thus a violation of sacred boundary law. Everyone policed everyone, constantly. Now imagine living in that world, where a bad harvest, a drunken comment at a dinner party, or your slave's clumsy theft of someone's sandals could land you in court, staring down a prosecutor with excellent diction and a personal vendetta, and you can't just not show up, because absence was interpreted as guilt. If you failed to appear in court, the judge could rule in absentia, which usually meant, we assumed you're guilty because, honestly, who skips their own defence unless they have something to hide? So now you're present, and broke, because even an acquittal didn't refund your legal expenses. You still owed your advocate, your witnesses, the man who loaned you his clean toga, the boy who stood outside the courthouse all day, holding your place in line while you sobbed into a cup of watered wine. Roman justice was expensive, which is why many poor citizens simply didn't engage with it. If you were too poor to hire help, you either represented yourself, a truly desperate move, or you let it go. You swallowed the loss, you absorbed the insult, you stayed quiet when your neighbour stole your goat because shouting about it might cost you everything else. Some turned to divine justice instead. They wrote cursed tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with requests to the gods of the underworld. May Gaius lose his speech and fall into a latrine. May Lucia's wine always be vinegar. Then they folded the tablet, drove a nail through it, and buried it in a grave or tossed it in a sacred spring. It was legal, it was therapeutic, and no one cross-examined you afterward. But let's say you were stubborn. You filed the complaint. You went to trial. You even won. What then? You might think the system rewarded you. Instead, you became noticeable. A man who rocked the boat. A name now known to the wrong ears. You could be marked as litigious, troublesome, a lover of lawsuit, which sounds flattering, but in Rome it wasn't. Patrons might avoid you, neighbours whisper, future business deals become suddenly unavailable, and if your victory embarrassed someone powerful, they'd remember and retaliate, slowly, subtly. Your taxes might increase. Your son might be passed over to the next priesthood. Your imported perfume might get accidentally misrouted to Numidia. Rome didn't need prisons to ruin you. It just needed memory. The memory of your trial. The memory of your argument. The memory of the one time you stood too tall in a city that preferred people stooping politely. And then, life resumed. Markets reopened. Temples were swept, chickpeas boiled. The latest scandal took centre stage, involving a praetor's wife, a bronze statue, and a very confused goat. No one spoke of your trial anymore, but no one really forgot either, because Rome was a city of stories, and now you were one of them. A courtroom tale whispered between wine cups, a moral lesson for dinner guests. Or worse, a footnote in someone else's speech, a for example, when describing what not to do when defending yourself before a jury of your peers and your enemies. And the forum buzzed on, scrolls shuffled, advocates practiced, scribes dipped their pens, and somewhere someone plotted their next case, probably against you. Because justice in Rome wasn't just a system. It was a habit, and breaking the habit, that was the hardest trial of all. But let's not imagine Rome's legal system was always so bleak. Sometimes, occasionally, it offered a moment of glorious, unexpected absurdity, like the time someone tried to sue a statue. No, really. Roman law, in its boundless creativity, allowed for non-human entities to be held accountable in specific, often ceremonial contexts. Statues could be put on trial. Animals, too. Even inanimate objects, like a roof tile that fell and killed someone could become a defendant. And if the object was found guilty, it could be exiled, just like a human citizen, thrown into the sea, or moved outside the sacred city boundaries. Problem solved. Because clearly it wasn't poor building codes or a drunk stonemason, it was the tile's fault. This brings us neatly to one of the most bizarre institutions in Roman public life, the Vestal Virgins. Their trials were unlike any others, and their punishments, well, those were the kind of nightmares only Rome could invent. The Vestals were priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth. They were chosen as little girls, pledged to 30 years of chastity, ritual fire maintenance, and never blinking during public ceremonies. They were revered, protected, honoured. But if a Vestal broke her vow, if she was even suspected of breaking it, Rome didn't send her to a normal courtroom. She was tried by the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest, often a politically powerful man with one eye on religious law and the other on his Senate career. And if she was found guilty, she was buried alive. Because you couldn't kill a Vestal directly, that would anger the gods. So instead, they placed her in a chamber beneath the earth, with a loaf of bread, a small lamp, and their deepest, most hypocritical apologies. The city wept, publicly. The priests looked sombre, and the street vendors sold commemorative honey cakes. Rome was nothing if not committed to a theatrical exit. But let's step back, because maybe you're not a Vestal. Maybe you're just an ordinary Roman again, this time entangled in a civil dispute, a business disagreement, a land squabble. You don't want to go to court, you want arbitration, so you turn to a iudex privatus, a private citizen appointed as a judge for your case. Not a legal professional, just a respectable guy with decent handwriting and a reputation for fairness. The proceedings are informal, held at someone's house, maybe with wine involved, maybe during lunch. You plead your case, your opponent pleads his, and then the iudex thinks, scratches his chin, quotes Cicero badly, and gives a verdict. No appeals, no theatrics, just a neighbourly resolution by someone who once settled an olive oil pricing dispute, and now considers himself the Solomon of Subura. This was Rome's quieter legal path, and many preferred it. Because the formal courts, they were a circus. But sometimes you couldn't avoid them. Say you were a provincial governor, now back in Rome after a few years administering your assigned territory. If the locals hated you enough, they could send complaints, official ones, through embassies, with petitions signed by dozens of sweaty, sand-covered dignitaries from Bithynia or Cilicia. And suddenly, you're on trial for extortion. You appear in court hoping no one brings up the gold statue you commissioned of yourself with public funds. Or that time you sold grain meant for famine relief. Or the temple you accidentally turned into a bathhouse. Your best hope? Delay the trial. Claim illness. Or that your advocate's uncle died. Or that the stars are unfavourable for legal proceedings. Romans were deeply superstitious, and legal calendars bent easily under the weight of omens. Still, eventually the trial happens, and if you're convicted, you might face exile, or a fine so large you'd have to sell your wife's dowry jewellery and at least one of your morally questionable nephews. But more often, you're acquitted, because you're connected. You know people. You've hosted dinners, given gifts, shared vintage Falernian with senators who now can't remember why they ever disliked you. Justice was slow and soft, especially if you had influence, which is why the truly powerful rarely feared the courts. They feared public opinion more. A scandal could do what a conviction couldn't, ruin their image, so they managed it carefully, staged their grief, funded games, built fountains, adopted orphans, named roads after themselves, because if the people loved you, The courts could frown, but they wouldn't touch you. And now we approach the final cruel twist. Say you survived the trial, you won, or lost with dignity. What do you do now? You write. Romans were obsessed with recording their victories, and even legal ones. You pen your own version of events, emphasise your clever lines, downplay your moments of panic, invent applause where there was only silence. You publish your speech, and suddenly your trial becomes literature. A stylised, edited, self-flattering account of what may or may not have happened. It joins the growing library of courtroom dramas, read by students, mimicked by aspiring lawyers, quoted in future trials by people who never even liked you. Because in Rome, the final verdict wasn't from the judge, it was from posterity, and if you were lucky, you weren't remembered for the crime, you were remembered for the performance. That's how Roman justice worked. Not with truth, but with style. So what have we learned from this gentle tumble down the marble steps of Roman justice? That being innocent wasn't enough, that having truth on your side didn't mean having the crowd, that your guilt or innocence in the eyes of a Roman courtroom mattered only slightly less than your network, your wardrobe, and your ability to cry on cue. It wasn't justice as you know it. It was theatre, and not even good theatre. Often more like an experimental one-man show with bad acoustics and way too much Latin shouting. You could be dragged into court for a sneeze in the wrong direction if someone influential didn't like your face. Or spared entirely for poisoning your aunt, as long as you donated to a temple afterward. The courtroom was not a refuge for truth. It was a gladiatorial arena of egos, wrapped in togas, quoting Cicero while elbowing each other for better seats at the forum. And yet, despite the chaos, the corruption, the cruel public humiliations, the Romans loved it. Because for all its flaws, it was predictably Roman. Dramatic, public, personal. Everything in Rome was a performance, and the courtroom was no exception. The law might not have been fair, but it was always interesting. And now that your tunic is wrinkled from sitting through hours of senatorial finger-pointing, your ears are sore from oratorical acrobatics, and you've just realised your advocate's been plagiarising speeches from 3 trials ago. You can finally go home. Perhaps a little poorer, a little more cynical, but a little more Roman. And as we fade gently out of the forum, the sky above darkens with evening. The statues cast long shadows. The marble cools underfoot. The courtroom is emptying now, its echoes dissolving into the hum of the city. Cloaks are drawn tighter, sandals shuffle on cobblestones, and a quiet drizzle begins to fall, softening the edges of the day. You hear it. The rain. Not the thundering kind, but the gentle, whispering Roman kind, falling on tiled rooftops, dripping from archways, trickling past monuments and forgotten verdicts, software persistent, patient, just like history. So close your eyes. Let the murmurs of the forum fade. Let the voices, Cicero's, Cato's, maybe even your own, dissolve into rain and stone. The court is adjourned, and the night belongs to dreams. Sleep well.